Hello and welcome to the Print's Soft Cover. Now, this is a platform where we launch select non-fiction books. I'm Snehesh Alex Philip, and it's a pleasure to host this edition. Why? Is because I have three fantastic authors, two of whom I've closely followed and read and heard also. Well, I'm talking about none other than the former R&AW chief, A S Dulat, the former ISI chief, Asad Durrani, and of course we also have Neil K Aggarwal. He's a psychiatrist based in the US, and he's also a professor at the Columbia University, where he's also the psychiatrist and social scientist. The reason why all of us have come together is because the three of them have come out with a book called Covert, the Psychology of War. You know, the book that you can see on the screen. Now, before I start this conversation, remember that this book, I cannot really term it as a follow-on of, the Spy Chronicles, but this book comes out from the Spy Chronicles itself. Am I right, Dulat Saab?
Well, that's the way it sort of ended, I would say. But if you read my foreword, I thought it was a bit of a joke when it started. But life is, an accident, and a lot of things happen accidentally. And I think this is an accidental book. But the soul of it all is our friend Neil Aggarwal, the psychiatrist.
So it's very kind of you to say, Dulat Saab.
So, Mr. Aggarwal, why this book? And why this, what do you mean by psychology of war?
So I think there's several reasons. First and foremost, when we talk about the psychology of war or the psychology of peace, that right now, as far as I know, AI or technology has not entered the negotiation space. Maybe that will come in the future. But right now, humans are involved in the business of war and peace. So we have to understand what humans are about. And psychiatrists and psychologists have developed a very intricate understanding of how humans operate in negotiations. And so, for example, how do people think? How do they feel? How do they react? What are their worldviews that they bring to negotiations? What are the small group dynamics in relationships? All of these points are what psychiatry covers. And when we're talking about peace, whether it's India and Pakistan, or Russia and Ukraine, or Israel and Palestine, then since humans are involved in fighting war and making peace, we have to understand what humans are about. That's why this book has been a project between the three of us.
Okay. As I was reading his foreword, this foreword also mentions about the Spy Chronicles and how it actually led to inspire this particular book. Durrani Saab, when the Spy Chronicles came up, there were a lot of controversies surrounding it, right? And you had to face a lot of issues back home in Pakistan. If you could tell our viewers what really happened at that time, which of course this book also covers.
I said that this is the story of my life. I think Mr. Dur talked about something happened accidentally. In my case, of course, the accidents have happened, but I take a plunge without actually realizing what is going to come out at the end of it. Call it recklessness or too much faith in my destiny. So I got into it, the Spy Chronicles. Never even gave a thought that it could, ruffle some feathers at home. When they did, again, it turned out to be so much to my benefit. I found out that it was not about the book, but because of certain other things. HarperCollins has published my novel, Honor Among Spies, that explains as to what happened. Another accident, I think, again, when Dr. Aggarwal, decided to contact us and carry out some sort of a cross-examination or psychological, investigation into our minds. Again, I didn't have the foggiest idea what would come out of it. I said, well, here is a curious man. I mean, that is their job. They try to find out what led us to this madness. But after some time, he said, well, I suppose we can do a put together because both of you seem to understand more about this psychology of war, psychology of spyware. It just so happens. I mean, I understand much less about spy warfare. I was an accidental spy, as written in the Spy Chronicles. I've also never thought that I could understand or I did have any idea of professional psychology. But of course, I knew something about the causes of war, about the strategy of peacemaking, about the failure of peacemaking. So I agreed to come along, and there is a result which, again, surprised me. I had no idea that this will get so much of traction, that people from far off, the Marathis and the Punjabis and the Urdu speakers would like to also find out what's happened there. So Allah's blessings, let me put it very, very briefly. That's what has happened to me, and I'm so glad about that. That noise at home. By now, enough number of people know at home as well, and that is why I suppose I'm quite comfortable with whatever has happened. And the benefit is had all mine, because I found out a couple of things about which I was very curious. But for that, you have to read that novel.
Both Dulat Saab as well as Durrani Saab are the doyens of the track to diplomacy. And but how did this track to diplomacy really come about? And what's the history? What is actually a track to diplomacy? Mr. Aggarwal, does psychiatrist have any role to play in track to diplomacy?
You may be surprised to know that it was in fact a psychiatrist named William Davidson who, with a US diplomat named Joseph Montville, introduced the very term of track to diplomacy. They wrote this article called Foreign Policy According to Freud in 1981 that was published in this US journal called Foreign Policy, where they suggested that in order to understand how people think in negotiations, then track 2 can be a way to supplement official track 1 negotiations. And track 1 negotiations are thought of at the government to government level with diplomats. Track 2 is thought more informally of people who are no longer in government service, but have access to government policymakers, to decision makers. And so, as they put in their article, track 2 is not going to solve issues around territory or resources or disputes around water sharing or other kinds of material, concrete disputes. But what it can do is improve people-to-people understanding, and that's where psychology has a role to play. But I'll leave it to the 2 co-authors I have who have practical experience with track 2 to say more.
Before I go to them, I just wanted to ask you one more thing, Mr. Aggarwal. You mentioned the fact that this track 2 as a term was, given out by a psychiatrist way back in the 1980s. But your book also mentions about the fact that, the actual thought process actually dates back to the 1930s itself.
Yes. There was a very fascinating exchange of letters between Albert Einstein and Sigmund Freud. And that took place in 1933. Albert Einstein wrote to Sigmund Freud asking whether psychoanalysis has a role to play in resolving disputes among mankind. And Sigmund Freud wrote back a couple of months later with a very dim view, saying that no, in fact, as a part of human psychology, that humans are very destructive, they are very competitive, they are driven towards the death principle. And so in Sigmund Freud's estimation, there wasn't a role for psychology or a sub-branch of psychology that we know of as psychoanalysis to play in peace. So for several decades, there was no real work done in this area until William Davidson and Joseph Montville really tried to ignite interest again in the 1980s.
Well, there you go, viewers. The track to diplomacy was a term which actually came about in the 1980s, as he rightly mentioned, but the thought process began way back in the 1930s itself by Albert Einstein. Dulat Saab, you've led track to dialogues, and of course, this book also talks about whether those track to dialogues have achieved anything or not. But in your frank assessment, does track 2 really help, and does it impact the policymakers who do track 1?
Not at all. I don't think so. And I think the book mentions that track 2 doesn't help track 1 in any way. And my own take from track 2 was that the people on the other side, our friends, the Pakistanis, were better at it than us. They possibly took back something, while we brought back zero. In fact, one of our former national security advisors once asked me, "You go for these track 2 meetings. What do you expect to achieve?" I said, "Nothing. I go for the jaunt and to meet friends." And that's how most of track 2 was. But let me tell you that track 2 actually got hyped up after the Mumbai attack, as I see it. And I can also tell you that, having spent a lot of time with General Saab, that if it had not been for track 2, there would have been no Spy Chronicles. And it was our talking together, sitting together, and which led to Spy Chronicles. In fact, Peter Jones of the University of Ottawa once said to us in a meeting, he said, "You two get along so well. Why don't you write a book?" And I looked at General Saab and he laughed and he said, "Even if we wrote fiction, nobody would believe us." So that was that. Then somewhere along the line, I wrote this book on Kashmir, and General Saab seemed to like it. And then he said to me, "I think we could do a book together." And of course, the encouragement, the backing came from Peter Jones. And that's how Spy Chronicles came about.
Oh, lovely. General Durrani Saab, you've been the former ISI chief. Now, ISI is considered to be, as far as India is concerned, is considered to be an organization which has always, talked in terms of terror, right? How, from being an ISI chief, now you're considered as a peacenik. And this you've touched upon in your book also. So what do you say when people call you a peacenik?
Yeah, I suppose some people have come to that conclusion that what I've done after my retirement is about peacemaking. Frankly, I did try to study how to make peace. And that, again, I'm talking about accident, that was accidental because the formula of composite dialogue in 1909, I think the Gujarat, your Prime Minister, was the author or the godfather, and got me interested, and I started studying it. And I studied it from the point of view of a soldier who's known how to deploy troops in a manner in which the various tracks help each other. And I thought this was a very good one. And ultimately also came to the conclusion that despite all that, it is not essential that if you have a good design that you will also reach peace. Because for peace, you need almost everyone on board. War can be started by any bloody fool. And accidentally it can start, or someone, undertakes something stupid in the Balkans. But to make peace, you have to have everyone on board. And the worst part was that people will only come on board if they find out that the peace is in their interests. if they think they are prepared to pay the price of peace, which of course extracts a big price because, upsetting the status quo would mean you make certain concessions, allow certain things, you go back on some of the core policies, and if you can manage the conflict with less cost, you will not. I was also once, sent to Oslo.
Yeah.
It's that gathering of the biggest peacemaker, the best of them. Everyone was such a good expert. All that lacked was that whenever I asked them, did you succeed anywhere? And the answer was no. Even Palestine, Israel, their flagship operation fell apart very soon. So to say that one was a peacemaker is a little, trying to overegg the pudding. But in my case, I actually came to certain conclusions which helped me. Now also in the track too, which was essentially about, as Mr. Dulat says, getting to know each other and finding out how the others feel. The governments are hardly ever interested in that. If they were to, pick up a piece from here and there, by now the world would have been a very different thing. Collateral benefits of spy chronicles are well known. Collateral damage also may happen off and on. But the real beneficiaries, because that is where it started, of the track twos, are the people who sponsor a couple of $100,000 and you're getting the best possible opinion that the unofficial India, Pakistan, or Afghanistan can provide, which is much better than, the yap that goes on officially through the foreign offices. That's what they get. Out of the process, people like Mr. Dulat, myself, we get to know each other. These type of friendship and these types of contacts can develop. And why forget, ultimately, you land up also knowing Dr. Aggarwal. And it was again a very surprising, happening. And all that is owed to whatever we started very innocently. We considered that as track 2, 2.5, track 3, illusionary, even no track at all, just, tracklessly meeting each other and talking to each other. So that is what has happened. And that's I'm so happy. I'm so a great beneficiary. And this whole phenomena I put together in another book. That's the book on which I had worked for a very long time, 10 or 15 years, and called it Adrift. We are usually moving in a certain direction, not because we want to, because the events are taking us there and we go along. And those events and the mainstream determines the direction we will take.
Can I interrupt real quickly?
Absolutely.
I just want to register my respectful disagreement with both of them. And I know that they are my seniors and they're very gracious. Dulat Saab and General Durrani have spoken rather negatively about track 2. And I'm not here to defend track 2 at all, let alone because I'm a psychiatrist. But what I do want to point out is that if track 2 had not happened, the two of them would not have met. Had the two of them not met, they would not have gotten along. Had the two of them not gotten along, then Spy Chronicles would not have been produced. And if had Spy Chronicles not been produced, then some of the real insights around strategic thinking that they both have mentioned would not have been generated. So for example, Durrani Saab, you've also mentioned that one of the great benefits of the Spy Chronicles is that now from what you have heard, and I don't want to sound too spooky in front of the two spooks before us, but one of the benefits that you've heard is that certain countries now have established a back channel or at least a line of communication. So that way, whenever there's an attack, that there can be a way that communications are arranged. So a counterattack can be then delivered that lowers the collateral damage on both sides. But that understanding could have only happened if you both had written Spy Chronicles, which came out of track 2, no?
Well, that backdoor negotiations or information sharing can be seen in as recent as the Israel Iran conflict. When the Iranians struck first, the Americans were already aware. The Iranians had informed the Americans. And when the Israelis struck back the Iranians were also informed about it through back channel talks.
That's Spy Chronicles.
That's Spy Chronicles.
That's Spy Chronicles. But Spy Chronicles came out of Track 2, no?
I think Neil has got it slightly wrong. I was not rubbishing Track 2, but I said that governments end up rubbishing Track 2. I think there are advantages of Track 2. We once had a Track 2 for spooks. And in my thinking, and I think it was General Saab's idea, a lot of good came out of that. In fact, there was some wonderful idea. Not all of them followed through because that's how governments function. So the problem with Track 2 is that governments don't take it seriously. Even if you take something back serious to a government, there's no response to it.
But until then, it's a government sanctioned Track 2 dialogue.
You know it better.
Well, I meant until and then it's a government sanctioned Track 2 dialogue. Then, of course, the governments do take notice and the governments use these Track 2 dialogues. Am I wrong, sir?
No, these government sanction, as General Saab explained, comes out of the funding. But I don't think it requires or has any particular sanction. These things go along, and I think there's a lot of good there because you meet people, you get to learn things. Every time that I've attended a Track 2 meeting, I can tell you personally, I've come back much more knowledgeable. I've learned things, and but governments don't look at it like that.
Okay, fair enough.
I can try and think of many connections between the Spy Chronicles and what has been happening in the Middle East, Israel, Palestine, Iran, etc., etc. It's not because one wants to give a pat on one's back. I don't think this was the original idea. People must have known about it, but we came up with an idea in Spy Chronicles that sometimes we get stuck with a situation in which we must act, must be seen to be acting, but we have a problem to doing something which is actually very, very substantial. And that gave rise to, our defining that moment or suggesting a choreographed response. We get in contact with each other and it says, we will do this, you will do this. Both of us will ultimately, be redeemed in the eyes of our people that we've done it. But we not do anything stupid. It has happened, probably it happened before also, but it has happened after that in Kashmir, in Balochistan, and especially in Middle East, not only the latest Iran thing, but also earlier. People have gone and hit empty bases, just to give the idea that we are going to. They will hit empty places, they'll bombard empty places, and so that their own people are happy. So that's just one thing. And as I said, it may not be. But the most interesting part that I wanted to talk about was what Dr. Aggarwal said about, if this did not happen, and that would not have happened, and ultimately. I agree, but I'm also reminded by a very old Misra of the Urdu poetry. Magas ko baag mein jaane na do, कि नाहक खून परवाने का होगा. If the honeybee went and sat on a flower, ultimately the price would be paid by the parwana, by the worm, because it will go and burn itself in the candle which has been produced by the honeybees and interacting with the. So all these things do have a chain. You do make the difference. And that is what the life is. It's not because you are steering in a particular direction. It is because the evils take you in that direction. And the ability to take care of them in a sensible way is all on us, on the decision makers. And I will end up, people like to be very optimistic and optimistic. The state, the apparatus, is the most incompetent thing that one has ever come across. They build up scenarios, they talk of national interest, they carry out such disastrous things in the name of national interest that all those events must continue to go from bad to worse. That seems to have happened. Please forgive me for trying to not only sponsor but trying to suggest a curve that we followed. It should be very interesting for us psychiatrists like Dr. Aggarwal. That seems to have happened over a period of time, and that's why you see that instead of the world getting better, making more peace, all these United Nations and so on happening, we go from crisis to crisis, every crisis worse than before. I hope I have provoked enough my participants, my people who are attending this one.
Well, Mr. Aggarwal, before you answer to him, I just have two questions to you. We're running short of time. But one question, we have two former spy chiefs. When they were in the hot seat as the chiefs of their respective agencies, they were at war with each other. Suddenly after retirement, as he said, some people consider them as peaceniks. Even in India, Dulat Saab, a lot of people would consider Dulat Saab as a peacenik, or would consider that his approach is more of a softer approach, suddenly. So what is it? Is it something to do with the fact that you're now retired? Is there a psychological reason why suddenly, post-retirement or at the later stages, one tends to become more of a peacenik and tends to become even more religious also? I've seen that with my parents, and I've seen that with other parents of my friends. Suddenly once they're off 60, they suddenly become very religious too. Is there a psychological reason? Or do you think these are genuine changes from experience that comes about?
This is a question for who?
This question for you, Mr. Aggarwal, since you're the psychiatrist here.
Well, I don't want to give anything away, but exactly what you have asked is what we cover in chapter 2, when Dulat Saab, after several sessions of me asking questions but not providing any kind of analysis, then asked me to provide an assessment of the two of them,
Exactly.
which is provided, that is provided at the end of chapter 2. So your question is answered at the end of chapter 2, and we'll encourage your viewers to pick up a book to see the answer. I don't believe that it's all of a sudden. I think when we look at General Saab and Dulat Saab's life longitudinally, there are clear motivations and personality traits that help to explain certain aspects of their trajectory into peacemaking. And so one sees that right from childhood, where I think both of them describe a certain comfort with solitude and going against institutional norms. But I don't want to disappoint your viewers or to forestall the conclusions that they might be able to read about in chapter 2.
So, Dulat Saab, this is the last question is to you. Now, this book also talks about stress, the psychological stress that one really goes through. For example, I was the PTI correspondent for Pakistan in 2013, and I was posted in Islamabad. This was supposed to be a 3 to 4 years posting, but I got expelled within 9 months. So I came back in 2014. I felt that the assignment was a breeze, but when I came back, I did my medical checks. My sugar had shot up to, it was, I think, 550 or something. It was so high. During my tenure in Pakistan, I had an R&AW officer who was an open post. He died of a brain stroke. Now, so what are the kind of stress that one goes through, and how do you counter these stress? And this is something that even normal life viewers would undergo stress. How do you counter stress, sir?
Yeah, there is stress. There's no doubt about it. The biggest stress is the stress of loneliness in our job. And once you get out of it, there is a sense of relief. And that may be one of the reasons which takes you towards thinking of peace. But I've always thought of engagement even while I was in service. And, because I had coincidentally a lot to do with Kashmir, I spent a lot of time looking at Kashmir. I still do.
You were with the IB then, and then you moved to the RAW. So IB looked a lot at Kashmir.
I've always believed that the answer to Kashmir and the answer to everything is engagement. And one of the things, of course, which Dr. Aggarwal may not have, I'm sure he's noticed it, but hasn't mentioned, is that right from my school days, and that's what we learned in school, I have always been for the underdog. And that is possibly explains, some of the questions that Dr. Aggarwal has raised. General Saab knows me very well, but Neil and I are just getting to know each other.
Perfect.
I think,
yeah.
I wanted to point out one thing, that if I had a little bit of a psychological kind of card up my sleeve that I didn't reveal to either of them when we were doing the book, but I'll reveal now, is that one of the most fascinating things that I think takes place in chapter 1 and chapter 2 of the book is that when we're actually even chapter 3, now that I'm thinking about it, is that in asking both of them to react to questions at the same time and to take turns, that we learned that there were certain details that they both did not know about each other, but that came out. And I think that generated a very rich kind of bond among the three of us that is interesting, because certain details about General Saab's life that Dulat Saab did not know about, and vice versa, then acted as points of departure for further conversations for us to have, particularly when we were talking about their childhood and adolescence, or how they both transitioned into intelligence roles. And the ability for both people, or for both men, to kind of learn about each other by listening to the other narrate their life experiences, I think was really instrumental in cultivating a sense of empathy. And I think that's a unique approach that psychiatry or that psychology has, which is like in bearing witness to someone's life story, one can cultivate empathy here.
Well, there you go. Thank you so much, the three of you, for joining us here on the soft cover. Yes, sir?
No, simply, one wanted to simply say that it's not true that the spy masters of the rival countries are at war with each other. In fact, they are each other's colleagues, each other's friends, because they, after having carried out the assessment, they know the dangers, the risks involved. And that is why they would be very happy that if there is some sort of a covert line between them, then they could talk to each other and say, well, this is something that may have to be taken care of. I am very grateful to one of Mr. Dulat's successors. Rajendra was the name. At some stage, I needed his help. Mr. Dulat facilitated that help.
In 2015.
He said, of course we would do it, because he is our colleague. I was supposed to be colleague. Our job is to carry out an assessment, and if we can do a good job of that and tell people that, look, this is the one, please do not react or be underreact. Otherwise, things can mutually escalate to a war or a conflict that no one wants. That is our job, basically.
Well, I completely agree with you. I am of the firm opinion that you need to talk to each other. Talking is very important. Not talking can lead to an n number of things. No matter, even if there are no results, it's important for the two sides to keep talking to each other. But thank you so much for the three of you for joining here on the soft cover. And viewers, as you can see, this is the book that you should go out and buy to know about the psychology of war. To understand how the psychology really plays a role in whether you're working towards a war or towards peace. Thank you so much. you.